All right, 11:17 a.m. sharp. We're gonna kick off. So, hi everyone, and welcome to today's AMA. Just as a reminder for anyone joining us for the first time, we host these every Friday on a variety of topics, from what's going on in testnet to some big initiatives that we're kind of releasing as we move from testnet to betanet to mainnet and beyond. So, the topic of today's AMA is the Metaverse-as-a-Service Whitepaper, which is a 54-page paper that we dropped last Tuesday for a 24-hour community preview and Wednesday to the general public. As a quick reminder to anyone participating in Quest, all of our Metaverse-as-a-Service related quests will be closing today after the AMA. So if you haven't yet already, grab your first look Metaverse-as-a-Service badge, make sure you've read the paper, and feel free to share your thoughts in the survey. I think a lot of those thoughts, we've been reading them, a lot of really good questions that came up within that survey, as well as a lot of really good feedback and thoughts for the paper and future kind of publications and work that we'll be building. So as always, community is amazing. We had over 1,500 people who claimed their first look badge over the last week and provided commentary and feedback on the paper. So again, we're super excited, and I'm really happy today to be joined by LAMINA1 Chief Product Officer Tony Parisi, who really led a huge amount of the writing of this project. CTO Will Carter, who anyone who attends AMAs should know very well by now, who also was, integral in the writing of this. And then Bar-Zeev, who is the CTO at RealityPrime, XR pioneer, and is also the third sort of co-author of this paper, and has been deeply involved with us. At LAMINA1, we're all about, decentralization and expanding our community. So yeah, we pulled Avi in, and he's done some really awesome work. And we're going to have everyone kind of introduce themselves before we kick off. But yeah, that's we're really excited to kind of dive in. And I guess to begin, I'm just going to hand things off to Tony, Will, and Avi just to give us a little bit of background. What is this paper? Why did we write it? What was the process? And what were we hoping to achieve? So Tony, if you want to kick off and just give us a little context before we dive into questions.
Sure thing. Welcome everyone, GM, NGA, GE, wherever you may be. Thank you, Ivy. So this notion of Metaverse as a Service is not even something that we at LAMINA1 coined. It's been kicking around for the last few years. The idea that there could be a set of turnkey system services that creators can use to get going in the open metaverse without having to roll their own on literally every part of the stack, which is kind of what the history of 3D gaming has been, even with the advent of game engine tech that makes a lot of pieces of this easier to pull together a virtual world with multiple participants, create and deploy all the content. It just requires so much of a stack. And our vision is that someday that's as facile as putting together web pages at anyone of any stripe, whether you're just an artist, in terms of not having technical capabilities, or maybe you're a technical artist but you don't know how to build a whole multiplayer server, or you're purely a programmer but not an artist. You can work together with people who have an open set of tools, and leaning toward the idea that someday this is all based on open standards as well. So creation of metaverse content should be roughly akin to creating websites and web pages, and then running and operating those in the same fashion should be built on an open infrastructure of tool and service providers. Now, of course, you still need 3D skills to create the 3D content, though, of course, with the advent of artificial intelligence, generative tools and all that, maybe that's going to get easier in the next few years as well. But that's, roughly the idea. What if creation for the open metaverse was similar to creation for the open web, and there was a, level playing field all around of tech and service providers to do that? Now, that's informed by years and years of my own experience working on open 3D technologies and standards. And that's also where Avi ducked into the paper, because he and I have been collaborating on and off for over a decade already. And he's got as longer actually history in this technology as I do, with exposure to all kinds of 3D simulation technology, XR devices, and so on. Now, when you combine that with blockchain tech to provide for secure and transparent transactions that allow creators to get paid, that allow us to track the provenance of digital assets, and then do some novel things around virtual rights, it gets really interesting. And that's the sweet spot that we tried to target in this paper. One more bit of preamble here would be that If it's not clear, if you've read this paper, we're not tackling all of this at LAMINA1. We're trying to be the rallying point for an ecosystem of people to put technology together and work together with us and the rest of the folks in industry to build toward this future that we're envisioning. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Will.
I don't even know how to follow that, Tony. That was a great summary of what we're trying to tackle with this paper. I will say, just to add, the motivation for this paper was not to prescribe specific approaches, which should be obvious if you read it. This is an attempt to take, a broad look at the space, see what potential solutions are out there, try to take an honest look at what the pros and cons of those solutions are, and really start a discussion on, what tacks we can take or which tracks we can take to making this vision a reality. So I just wanted to add that kind of context. When you're looking at this, you may, be frustrated because you're not seeing direct answers or, specifics, and that's all coming. But that wasn't the goal of this paper. The goal of this paper was to establish a vision that we're working towards.
And
Amazing.
I guess I'll just add.
Yeah, I was going to say, Avi, take the stage, introduce yourself to us.
No, there's great intros already. I'll just add, just a little bit about myself is, I have an independent company that's a consulting company, and I've been in this space for a long, long time. And the benefit, just to add to what Tony Will said, the benefit of having 30 years experience is that we've had these discussions for 30 years. This stuff has been, in the works, on the table, in production in various ways for 30 years. And so we've had, I wouldn't say every possible conversation, but it feels like we've had every possible conversation about different ways of doing this. And so a lot of those debates have happened. It doesn't mean that we have the right answers. It just means that we have a little bit of a shorthand for how to discuss the options. And I think one of the goals of this paper is sort of echoing on what Tony said, is to have the discussion, to open it up, to bring everybody up to speed with what are the kinds of choices that need to be made. And then to see where everybody else stands, the people who have the experience, people who are new, and the whole spectrum, to try to come to some consensus about how to actually, put some nails in this and say that we're going to agree to do this way, and this way, and this way. And then that's the foundation of an open metaverse, so we can all agree on the basics and then move forward and build on top of that. So I'm all in on that.
Amazing. And I think that kicks us off perfectly for a nice sort of community question round. So a lot of these questions here were sourced from the feedback survey that a bunch of you guys filled out. A lot of these questions were submitted anonymously, so I'm not going to attribute this time like I normally do. But our first question is, why start with such a broad platform vision and not with, something like a simple game or something like that? Why did LAMINA1 start here?
Yeah, I'll take the lead on that to start, Ivy. And guilty as charged. It's intentionally broad. The thing is, we're not just trying to supply one set of widgets, solve one specific set of application problems. We're in the infrastructure business at LAMINA1. We want to provide a set of tools that's generally useful and a blockchain to back that up for lots and lots of different use cases. And when you do that, you need to kind of take a broader approach to this. Also, again, per our preamble, a lot of us have been doing this for a long time, and we know that the problem space is really big. It necessarily has to be kind of tackled at the high level, at a whole. But then, of course, it's also a great question, because to be practical, we're going to need to focus on some very specific use cases to start testing and proving out some of these ideas. Once we get to rights management, we can talk about that a little bit. That's a novel idea that we'll have to prove out in practice in terms of the right way to implement that. But then there's other pieces that are just like, they're super well established. Again, as Avi was kind of alluding to, we've seen the movie before in a lot of ways to say, transmit 3D files over the wire. And we have standards like GLTF, which I worked on in USDZ, based on the Pixar tech, that now have solved to some great degree delivering 3D file formats in a way that any application can ingest them, and people can collaborate on that content. But that's just one of a set of other problems that include, networking and persistence and the other things we talk about in this paper. But they've all been in many ways solved in previous iterations, maybe not with an eye toward open metaverse and with an eye toward connecting them up to blockchain tech. So that's some of the new stuff, and we will have to go in easy and start with some simpler use cases to test it. But would not really serve anybody if we focused on one narrow problem set here right now. There's just too many places to tackle. So you have to kind of just take a broad and long view against this, I think, and balance that against what is a legitimate desire, which is like, okay, give me something simple I can implement now. Again, we're not building a toolkit. We're trying to build an infrastructure. I don't know if Avi or Will want to amplify or elaborate on any of that.
Just the one thing I'll say is that, Tony, you have way more experience getting this kind of collaboration that's needed across the industry. But it almost never happens that one company has a successful game or app or whatever, and then says, hey, everybody else, you can copy us. You can do it. Because they're all competitors. And what you kind of have to do is prove something out and then bring everybody to the table and say, what do you want to do? Make a lot of compromises, but come together and agree on something. So anybody who comes in with the final answer is probably going to lose from that perspective. You just can't force people.
A slight counterpoint to that, the way you phrased it, at least, Avi, is like you could say Epic has done this with the Unreal Engine with great success. That was all within the context of, okay, we shipped some Unreal games. Here's the engine we used to build it. Now we'll make that available to you commercially. That's not the same thing as interoperability among different game titles.
Exactly.
Different universes,
exactly.
Right?
If Epic was to say, here's the protocol for the metaverse, tomorrow everybody should build to this, they'd get some people jumping on board, people who might be able to make money off of, building towards Epic's vision of it. But if they were going to try to get, all the other big companies to sign on, they wouldn't be able to just say this is the way to do it. They'd have to negotiate that, and everybody's going to bring something to the table.
And to be clear, that's exactly how they're approaching it in some of these standards forums, like the Metaverse Standards Forum, in fact, right? They're coming in open-minded, and they're being very, they're not being super prescriptive about this around, the Fortnite tools or anything else they may have. I think they're going to offer it in an open spirit. We'll see. So I think even Epic understands that. Yeah, that's all nuance, though. So agreed. Yeah, it's beyond any one entity's ability to prescribe this, including us, especially us, right? LAMINA1. Let's keep going, Ivy.
Yeah, so all right, question 2. I still don't really fully understand why your chain is optimized for the metaverse compared to others. Will, you want to help take this one?
Sure. So there's actually a couple of answers to this question, but first, maybe I'll add some additional context. So like in some ways this is semantics. Maybe the person who asked the question already understood this, but the goal at LAMINA1 is not just to build like a quote unquote blockchain, because there's really a lot of components, many that aren't technical, that make some blockchains more viable than others as actual infrastructure solutions and not just, pure data structures. So when you think about like the broader blockchain space as we know it today, there is the blockchain itself, but then there's also the tools you have to adopt, the wallets you have to create as a user, the complexity of the explorers, the nightmares of trying to KYC to use an exchange and get some of these cryptocurrencies. And all of these tools and the applications that coexist with them are part of what we in the Web3 space generally call the blockchain's ecosystem. And those ecosystem tools are generally really complex. And they're complex because they're aiming to provide broad functionality for a very heterogeneous set of applications that share these chains. So like when you look at Polygon, when you look at Ethereum, these are chains that have a shared computational environment. And on that environment, you have DeFi traders, you have NFT collectors, you have payment providers, you have gamers, you've got investors. Now you have decentralized social users. So you have a lot of different domains and a lot of different types of users that are being funneled into the exact same ecosystem tools. And frankly, the mainstream audience doesn't have the patience or inclination to learn this new complex set of tools, given that they're already skeptical of blockchain. And this is actually really important in understanding why a lot of major brands are so slow to consider joining or jumping into blockchain, because yes, there's technical and cost limitations, but more importantly, the UX is like such a nightmare that brands are just not going to take the risk of managing it, especially for an infrastructure they can't control. So like funneling back to the question, like how is Lamina 1 different? What are we trying to do different with our quote unquote chain? We are, number one, a blockchain that is curating an ecosystem of metaverse tailored applications and tools. So all of these tools and the applications that are using them are going to be more narrowly focused on metaverse specific activities. That doesn't mean that's the only thing that can exist, but that's where a lot of the energy of the ecosystem and the community is going to be focused. And then number two, we're ensuring that these creators, whether they're large brands or they're smaller creators, have more control over the infrastructure that they deploy on, while not trapping them or their users into walled gardens. And so our tools will be intuitive to mainstream Web2 users. The applications that use those tools will be metaverse specific, and that will be important to larger creators, which will attract mainstream adoption because these established brands aren't immersing their users in an ecosystem that's complex, that's focused on DeFi and monetization schemes, but instead an ecosystem that's focused on enabling compelling experiences. And then on top of that, from a technical standpoint, they'll be able to deploy their applications on what we call meta chains, and that gives them more control over how their specific blockchain functionality, however they decide to integrate it into their application, can actually be used and accessed. I think there's more technical questions following this one, so I'll stop it there, see if anyone else wants to add on to that.
Yeah, I mean,
I think one of the keys, I'll just jump in for a second, Ivy. I mean, one of the big keys here is to be able to split the database and network resources up to be optimized for smaller problem sets. As Will mentioned, when it comes to, let's say, the Ethereum network, everyone's trying to hit the main chain at the same time. And I think right now it's all about those meme coins, let's just call it that. But if you've seen Ethereum gas prices and everything right now, it's clearly a signal there's massive network congestion because everyone's trying to do the same thing on one big network, or a bunch of things rather on the same network. So, I mean, I think that's probably a good lead in to the next piece around metachains, Will, to drill into that a little more and why we think this is such an important next step in the evolution of blockchain tech, especially as we scale up.
Which brings me to question 3, which is, can you explain how specialized metachains can address the limitations of monolithic chains and allow for the creation of blockchain-based applications and experiences that cater to different needs and requirements? I think that's a Will question too. Also, whoever asked that question, like, fantastic question, and totally proving that you read and very thoroughly understood the white paper.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, so I'm going to start direct and keep it pretty approachable. But yeah, when you look at, and I had mentioned Polygon and Ethereum as kind of like really well-known monolithic chains. One of the problems with this approach is that all of the applications and users that use that chain or are built on that chain are sharing a single limited set of resources. So when, like, a really easy to understand example is like, you know, thinking about a slow internet connection in a house. If for a family, if a couple of people are streaming 4K Netflix while someone is downloading like a new game to their PS5 and another person is trying to do a Zoom call from their home office, you're gonna run into some bandwidth issues. Like there's gonna be slowdowns, and you're gonna have to prioritize some of that traffic because there's only so much that can go through that single internet connection. Now, in most blockchains, when this happens, you can force your application to the front of the line. So you can prioritize your traffic by paying more. And that generally means that everyone else using that chain at the same time also needs to pay more, or they get to wait until the chain is less busy. So it's not just that there's a performance bottleneck, like in that shared internet example, but there's also volatility in the cost of the network. And that's also a huge stopping point for the adoption of blockchain by some of these larger brands and companies, but also for smaller projects that are trying to emerge, because it's expensive, it's painful, and you as a project or an application or a product, you have to field the customer dissatisfaction for, again, infrastructure that you personally don't control. So we try to address this problem by like the notion of meta chains. And we take the approach of allowing applications to deploy their own blockchain rather than sharing that single monolithic one. And on that blockchain, they can define their own environment. So they can define the economic parameters. They can define the specifications of the nodes, which will generally define the chain's performance. They can even define the actual types of transactions that they allow to be executed on their chain. So, like, for example, if I'm developing a AAA game, I know I'm going to need a lot of throughput, and the Ethereum virtual machine, generally is a single-threaded computational environment. So, like, I need a way around that limitation. And I know that I also don't really need, as a AAA game, I don't need a bunch of people to develop smart contracts on my chain after I've deployed it. All I want is a blockchain ledger that stores my inventory items on player-controlled wallets, so that those players can own them, they can trade them, buy, sell, they can even take them to other platforms. So by using a meta chain to do this, rather than a shared EVM environment, I can actually adopt a different type of virtual machine that isn't like a general purpose computation environment. A bunch of people, like, once I deploy it, I can't write smart contracts on it that do, general purpose applications. But instead, I can define those transactions in a low level language that's very performant. I can start parallelizing transactions, which is something that's not possible in an EVM environment. And that'll be like a lot more performant for my specific needs. So, like, put simply, by scoping down the problem, you can allow for performance hacks that just wouldn't be suitable in a broader context, which is the context of these monolithic environments. And so the application ends up with a dedicated computational environment. All the bandwidth is dedicated for the application itself and its users. The fees are going to be predictable because it's not going to be dependent on applications that aren't even related to mine. And then, the community around that chain is going to be more focused around the experience or the creation itself. So, like, I do want to state, like, it's not as easy as like, oh, everyone build your own chain, because you still need to solve some pretty tricky problems around interoperability. You want to make sure that these chains are interoperable. And you also want to maintain like a level of security in these chains, because, a lot of these monolithic chains rely on like a safety in numbers like component, which means, like, as you start breaking off into smaller and smaller chains, you lose some of that economic safety. So those are some of the things you have to solve when taking this approach. But that, generally speaking, is the strategy for meta chains. It's making sure that creators themselves have a dedicated environment specifically for their application that they don't have to share with unrelated applications.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. That was an awesome deep dive. Next up, we have a question that asks, if blockchain technology is not suitable for building a metaverse or specific things in the metaverse, what platform will be the foundation of the project?
I'll start on this one, then I'd love Will to elaborate some more, because I think it's probably reacting to a couple of places in the white paper where I just wanted to be sure to call it out up front that people for the last couple of years, some folks have been, bravely trying to build things, 3D games and virtual world type of applications and store that data purely on blockchain. And for reasons we talk about in the paper, blockchain storage is expensive. Number one, Will just keyed on another whole aspect to this, which is EVMs. Today's EVMs are not built to handle 3D data. I mean, they could go on about that, but if you look at the instruction set in the Ethereum virtual machine, it's extremely primitive. It's for financial computation, not for 3D. So I just wanted to make sure that, there's sort of reacting to a Web3 purist sort of approach to trying to do virtual worlds where you try and do the whole thing on chain. It's just not built for that. That doesn't mean a lot of it can't be decentralized, which is why we talk about some of these notions around supernodes and some of the other decentralized simulation services. So I think it's probably, if I understand the question, a bit of a reaction to that. So I would not go so far as to say that blockchain technology is not suitable for building places in the metaverse. It just can't be the only part of the solution, the only solution. It has to be a part of a larger solution. Will, do you want to elaborate on that at all, or Avi for that matter?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think that's exactly right. When I envision even Web3 in general, like not just immersive experiences, but generally, I don't imagine like a fully decentralized, everything's decentralized. Every component of the application is decentralized. I think, and part of that's based on the limitations of the technical approach. I think what's important here is to take the components of whatever application you're building into consideration and find out which of those really has a value add when you add decentralization into the picture. So like in my mind, when it comes to immersive experiences, that might be identity. Identity is a big one for me personally. Being able to create continuity of experience, reputation, identity credentials that you can take with you between experiences and applications. There's obvious reasons why blockchain adds a lot to the picture when it comes to managing your identity. You don't want to kind of fall into the same Web2 traps that we're currently fighting, where you end up with really large corporations that control your identity and profit off of it. But there's other aspects to it as well, like, you know, when you look at a game and you look at kind of what aspects of that 3D experience really matter to you and which would you like to take with you if you were to leave that game. Part of it's your identity. Part of it's probably your avatar. So like, what do you look like? How do you present yourself physically? And then part of it's like the items and assets that you earn along the way. They all have a story behind them in these experiences, whether they're things that you built, things that you earned. So it's like trying to identify which components of the gameplay or the experience really benefit from being interoperable, from being decentralized, and making those aspects on chain, and the rest of it, you know, supported with the traditional centralized architecture, at least until we get to a point where the decentralized architecture is performant enough that you can start putting more and more of it on chain.
Our next question is, I wonder how LAMINA1 intends to approach data security. I don't have the technical know-how to ask super precise questions, just a general concern about hacks and theft of assets that are exchanged on chain. And note, we got a lot of questions about this from, I wonder how the issue of security in the metaverse will be solved. How's LAMINA1 approaching security? Huge issue brought up by readers of the white paper. And I think, Avi, we were talking about you maybe jumping in to take kind of like
Sure.
the first kind of philosophical part of this.
Yeah, I mean that it's hard to know the intent of who wrote the question, but you can break it into at least three different questions, right? So we should take all of those separately, but there's the kind of security that you worry about, physical security, like is somebody harassing me, is somebody griefing me, acting inappropriately. That's one kind of security that is often solved by content moderation in real time, and that has a whole bunch of issues. So let's put that one aside for a second. And then there's the security of the data, of the transactions. That's what we've been talking a lot about with the blockchain. And while I'm not the expert on the blockchain, the principle here is to apply the right level of security for each kind of transaction. And so I'm gonna take what Tony and Will said and make it, I'm gonna put it in the simplest possible terms to try to just make it easy. But if you imagine this is a tennis match, and it's a tennis match that we're playing at the local court or in the backyard, with our own net. You only need a certain level of security to who was in and who was out, who scored and who didn't score, and you can keep it pretty lightweight. You don't want to add a ton of infrastructure because it's going to slow everybody down. But when you're talking about Wimbledon and world champion tennis, you have officials, you have the infrastructure, you have all the things you need to make sure that the who won and who scored is secure. And in this case, we're talking about decentralizing the answer so that the crowd in some cases are the ones who decided what happened, and validated it. And that kind of security is super important as well. And what we've added in this white paper is some thinking around rights management. And that's a kind of security that goes with different kinds of transactions, right? We're used to the monetary transactions. I give you $1, you give me $1. But here we're talking about being in spaces, virtual spaces, where people are allowed to do certain things. And some of those things go back to the first question around harming each other, potentially. What am I allowed to do to you? What am I allowed to give to you? What am I allowed to take from you? But also the space itself. Am I allowed to write on the wall, or am I allowed to build things? So what we tried to do is iterate a whole variety of rights that people have. Ownership is just a collection of rights that include a bunch of things that we know. And if we can, the general answer to a lot of the safety questions, not all of them, is if we can articulate the rights and make it super clear what the rights are when you enter any given space, so you know what you're signing up for, you're essentially accepting a contract by coming into a space, then we can begin to address a lot of the security questions. We agreed to a certain set of rules when we came here. Again, back to games, let's say we can contrast a player versus player kill world where everybody's allowed to shoot anybody else at any given time. Contrast that with another world in which the rules are no, be nice to people, don't hurt them. We want people to know when they come into a space what to expect, so that they know not to come into a space that's going to be one that they're not going to enjoy, or maybe one that may take something from them that they don't want to give, like privacy and information about themselves. If they want to come into a space that says we're going to record the names of the people who came in, okay, that is a space I might not enter, versus one that says, we are going to record it, but we're only using this, for mitigating incidents between people. Okay, maybe that's reasonable. I'll accept those rules. So it's about being really clear. It's almost like the idea of smart contracts, but it's more like smart contracts between people. Like, what are we agreeing to in these transactions? And we need a language that I don't think is in the current set of smart contracts, out there in Web3, but we need a language for expressing this around spaces and objects and interactions so that we can at least agree on what we agree on. And then the people who break the rules, hopefully will have a way to deal with them separately.
I will say that, and great, Avi, and I've been learning a lot having these discussions with you and trying to get my brain to think in these ways. I just do want to note that both Decentraland and the Sandbox are, early open metaverse, blockchain-based systems that are doing some of this, but in a very limited way. Basically doing this connects up to the spatial subdivision questions we might get to later, but they have implemented smart contract-based systems to just say who owns what in plots of virtual land. That's as far as it's gone, though, to my knowledge, unless my knowledge is out of date. And even those are sort of in a 2D Cartesian system, as far as I know, and they're not even 3D volumes. But those, I imagine, could be expanded. And I know there's work going on in OMA 3, one of the standards groups that they're both part of, to start addressing some of these things. But to me, that's a very simple and limited form of this right management stuff that says who owns what in this metaverse that we're building right now. But it does not necessarily address some of the more fine-grained permissions or, in terms of what you can do with those plots of land or who can do them. And it also doesn't address things at a finer level of granularity that we know we need, because we built systems for years on this around objects. Who owns what objects? Do I own it? Am I the owner? Am I just possessing it right now? And we talk about this in the paper. What can I do with that? Do I have the right to modify it? And so we're going to a much deeper level with what we put in a simple table in the white paper. But even that, I think, needs a lot of development still. What do you think, Avi?
Yeah, totally. And ownership around stuff, digital stuff, has come up a lot in Web3 and under NFTs, right? That has been the intent of NFTs, was to be able to trade rights, but it's really been unclear as to which rights are you obtaining by purchasing an NFT or trading an NFT. Which are you transferring? That needs to be really, really clear. And in a virtual world, you have even more, right? When it's just a JPEG, you have the question of who owns the copyright. Are you actually transferring the copyright when you buy the NFT, or are you just getting a limited set of rights? But when you're in a virtual world, you have rights like, am I allowed to hold this? Am I allowed to use it? Can I break it? What am I allowed to? Am I allowed to take it and do something with it. All these rights now create this giant, list of rights that we can or may not give, including, the ones that fall under ownership, which are typically, the right to say what happens to something, the right to destroy something, the right to sell it. And there's also legal terms for those rights, but we don't try to get into those so much because nobody knows what those are. But the common sense ones are things you can just think about doing with any given object, whether it's a bicycle or a baseball bat or a ball. And we want to make sure that people know what they're getting, what they're signing up for when they get into these interactions, and what the result will be, so that they can be comfortable going in. In a very much similar way to what Will was saying about gas prices, the volatility and the uncertainty is bad. So the more structure we can provide in a lightweight way, the better people are going to feel about engaging in these activities and not feeling ripped off, or in many ways curbing the abuses, because the information will be all available up front.
Thanks, Avi. We have a question from a Discord member that came through earlier this week, Amy Chains, who's usually with us, but will hopefully be listening in later. But they ask, do you plan to implement L1 with new ERC 4337? Sort of tied into the security digital ownership conversation.
Yeah, everyone's favorite ERC lately. Yes, we're definitely looking at ERC 4337 for a few reasons. Going back to kind of like what makes us different and what we're trying to do as an ecosystem, which is provide more streamlined tools that are kind of more intuitive for mainstream users. ERC 4337 allows us to do that and kind of generate new user flows and new user experiences that make those tools easier to use. So we're definitely really interested in leveraging it. We don't have specific architectures for how it's going to be used just yet, but it also ties directly into, as Ivy just said, into the security conversation, because I think one of the biggest security risks in Web3 right now is this, number one, the onboarding process of generating these wallets, storing these private keys, but also in utilizing the wallets once you've generated them. Because these tools are so complex, a lot of people end up making transactions they don't understand to, addresses that they can't read. And so any way that we can simplify the process, make it clearer to the user what it is they're doing, I think is going to be highly valuable, and not only making the platform more secure, but also easier to adopt. So ERC 4337, we're big fans of. We're going to find a way to integrate it, but it's a little farther down in the roadmap.
The next question is from Ed Keys, who writes, very cool stuff. In looking for weak spots, the degree to which supernodes are trusted custodians of the metaverse state worries me a bit. If a user clicks on a portal and enters the space controlled by a malicious supernode, how much damage can that node do? For example, oh yeah, as soon as they entered, user X sold all their possessions to my NPC store clerk for 1 cent. Blockchain updated accordingly.
Thank you for reading the paper, Ed. It's clear that you actually read it. I mean, that's one of the key areas, and it got me thinking about this, and that makes my brain hurt because my brain just does not work that way. Avi, maybe you can start this one, and we can get a little bit of a powwow going among the three of us here on what we think of that. But this seems like a legit potential security hole that Consensus was designed to help solve. But I would love to get a little more specific than that.
Yeah, this is one. It's related to the thing that bugs me about a lot of the wallets today. Why should clicking on anything cause actions to happen without your permission? That just shouldn't happen. I mean, the first step is to know, when you enter this space, here's the possible things that can happen. Like, this space is asking for rights that you may not want to give. The space is like think of it as this is done. I think one of the best examples of where this is handled today, because it's been such a huge problem, is like on an iPhone, right? You want to install an app. The app says, I need the following permissions. I'm going to be using your camera. I'm going to be using your photos. Like, we need to make people aware of what this new space, this potentially malicious space, can do before it even has the option to do it. And I know that adds a lot of UX weight to the things of, right now on the phone, when you install an app, fortunately we're not installing apps like every day, all the time. So you click through it once and it's okay. But there's other things where Apple decided, we need to ask every time if it's okay to take your camera, because we don't know. You might be in a locker room or a bathroom. And so we're going to ask to open up your camera ahead of time. So alerting people to what might become a malicious activity before it happens is the first step in the security of that kind of thing. And that hopefully will go a ways to protecting it. And one of the ways to make the UX a little better, by the way, is that we can be establishing our own standards or privacy policies. Individually, we could be saying, I am not willing to go to any space that's allowed to take money from me. Just period. I'm just not, just warn me, tell me before I go in, but I'm just not in general going to go. And I'm going to set up that blanket policy. And so that doorway will be opaque to me. And hopefully we can teach people a little bit of security hygiene to say, don't open up your permissions, don't allow all these things to happen. But when they do happen, we can also have much better UX flows that say, hey, this is about to happen. This might not be what you intended. And so do you approve? Is this really okay? Again, we slow down the process a little bit. It may not be as simple as, if you're in a casino and you're putting coins in the slot constantly, you don't constantly want to be saying, yes, I agree to put a coin in the slot. But where it's appropriate and where we can flag these things, we do have an obligation at a systems level and at a UX level as designers to say, no, let's not have these negative patterns that allow people to be exploited. And the more we think of this thing as an operating system, the more we start to understand that that's the job of the operating system, is to protect the individual users and their data from exploitation and from people snooping and stealing. That's primarily what a computer operating system does, is make sure the data, who has rights, who doesn't have rights, are always enforced so that people can't cheat. That's a systems job, but it's going to take a lot of cooperation in the distributed system to make sure that there aren't any ways around that. I think it's the best answer I can give for now. There's a lot of work to be done though.
All right, I'm going to move on to our next question then. So next question is, how is/are spaces subdivided and addressed? Are there multiple coordinate schemes? Is there an origin? If so, where is it?
Oh boy, I love this one. This has been an ongoing this has been an ongoing conversation with so many of us for so many years and so long. And I'm going to approach it quite glibly, and I will just say, first of all, that there's internal hearty debate even within LAMINA1 and our four walls, including myself, Neil Stevenson, and other folks, about what the right answer is. There a right answer to this? And we talk about it a little bit in the future section of the paper, where we say, this is not solved. No one solved it yet. These are the kind of things we want to be thinking about longer term. But when you think about the web, and this is why I always start, the web has no origin. It's anyone's got their own origin to the web. For me, it's my Chrome with my tabs in it, and each one of those is kind of a jumping off point or a portal. And then there's my own home pages within that for the various websites I own. So to me, those are common entry points, but none of those are like the 000 origin of my web. And when I think of the metaverse, I think of that same kind of structure, that there are several spaces that all sort of exist on their own, but can hyperconnect to each other through portaling and whatnot. And there might be some large-scale worlds that have some internal consistent map that have more of that sense of contiguity and or uniformity to them. But I don't personally envision the metaverse as being one giant interconnected space that follows the rules of physical Cartesian space. I'll just leave it at that, because this is a massive topic, and I know you want to weigh in on this too, Avi.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think we can respect what Neil is trying to do with some of the realities of the situation. I think that what he wants from this is to say that everybody has a consistent experience, right? We shouldn't, the metaverse shouldn't be solipsistic, is one way to say it, where everybody gets their own totally different experience than everybody else and there's no commonality. Nobody really is asking for that. I wouldn't even call that the metaverse. So go with his definition, where everybody sees the same thing in the same place at the same time. That's a good definition. But it doesn't mean that the world is Cartesian. It doesn't mean that the world is stitched together in such a way that it's a giant grid, let's say. where there's no holes in the grid or no shortcuts through the grid. I think the reality is there'll be portals. There'll be spaces that appear and disappear over time. And sometimes you want to be able to insert a space in the middle of another space. And that may be okay because we don't have to follow the rules of physics in the metaverse. We can do whatever we want. But even the real world, if we were to follow the real world, there's no origin, right? The universe has no origin. There is no center. It's everything is relative to everything else. And so you might as well just pick yourself as the center, which is what all rendering does. When your computer actually renders the picture at the end of the day, you are actually at 0, 0, 0 for that image being rendered. And everything is drawn relative to you. That's fine. Everybody can have their own origin that way, but we have to account for portals and wormholes through space that make space a little weird, as long as everybody traveling through the same set of portholes gets the same experience. That's what's important, and that's what's going to, I think, live up to what Neil's asking for there.
Next, I'm going to jump into a couple of questions. We got a lot of questions about cloud rendering from the community after reading this white paper. So to kick off, asking, what are the benefits of using cloud rendering with pixel streaming and virtual world creation and operation?
Yeah, I'll start this one and I'll caveat it with saying that I have been not a fan of cloud rendering for nearly 20 years now, so people just need to know that going in. But I think it's for some legit reasons. I'm also trying to keep an open mind about it. So let's start with what some of the benefits might be. The idea here is that I could use a super powerful computer running in the cloud with a dedicated GPU, let's say, to really generate mind-blowing graphics and do all the hard computation out in the cloud on a more expensive device that then just streams me the resulting pixels in the form of a video stream that I can then experience on a lightweight mobile device. So that's putting the compute power in a place where it's appropriately used to generate seriously high quality images. There's a couple of issues that come with that, though. One is that there's potentially a lot of latency depending on your network configuration. So the performance of that, if you're going for something that's purely a lay back and watch it stream to you, but generated on the fly kind of experience may be okay. But if you're trying to round trip and interact with that thing in real time, like for a shooter game, there can be serious latency introduced for that, and it may result in a subpar experience. That's number one. Number two is the other thing is it doesn't come for free. The cloud being used to render that is using, again, some dedicated iron in the back somewhere, an NVIDIA GPU or something else, and you're effectively renting that for the duration. And you, the user, are paying for that, or the content creator's paying for that. Someone's got to pay for those cycles, just like they have to pay for network on Ethereum network. And, that costs computing cycles and hence dollars at some point. And so one of the biggest issues, even more than the latency issues, around the cost structures involved with cloud rendering. So it seems like a panacea for a lot of issues around being able to deliver a super high fidelity experience on lower powered devices. The issue is that it just comes at a cost. Avi, you want to take it from there?
Yeah, no, it's just jumping up on the cost thing. I think a lot of people don't appreciate that aspect because a lot of these services are subsidized when they start. The company hopes to get a lot of people up front, a lot of games up front, and then they can start charging for it later or charge for it in some other way, like ads or whatever, however else they're going to make their money. So the costs are often hidden. But at the end of the day, what's sitting in the cloud is a server in a rack with a GPU in it that might be, if it's NVIDIA's cloud, maybe they can charge themselves less for that GPU because they made it. They don't have a markup on it. But there's not a lot of economies of scale that can really be exploited to make it that much cheaper to go in the cloud. There's the fact that all these things are co-located and they're using common cooling and they're in the same building. That can save some money, but there's also a lot of losses that happen at scale. One of the easiest ones to imagine is, people like to play games a lot at the same time. They play together, or they might play on a Friday night with their friends. But are they going to play at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday morning? No. So a lot of the infrastructure that that company bought for their cloud rendering solution might sit idle unless they have other things they can use it with. So maybe a company like NVIDIA is in a great position because they can say, we're going to do all our protein folding at the time where nobody's playing games, but the same computer can be used for all these things. And if you can optimize the uses so that you get something like 95 to 99% utilization of all your cloud resources all the time, you're good. But if you see a giant spike on Friday night, that means you got to buy 10x the resources so you can support everybody. You're dead. You can't have a viable economic model that's going to be cheaper than everybody having their own GPU. And one of the things about having our own GPUs is not all of us need the highest end graphics. Some of us will do fine playing, playing a game like Civilization on a card with, a 6-year-old, video card, and we'll live with it. Some of us want to play the latest cutting edge games with the best graphics. Then maybe the cloud is a better solution if it can give you better quality than what I have. Maybe I only have a tablet or a phone. I want to have a better experience. Sure, the cloud is going to beat it. But I think people who already are saying, I'm just going to, buy a PC or buy a console, they know what they're signing up for. They know what the costs are and the prices and the economics are pretty well worked out for that.
Yeah, well said, Avi. And I just would add one more thing maybe, which is Tim Sweeney, his point of view on this from Epic has pretty much generally always been from a system architect's point of view, which is why not distribute the computing to where it happens? Why are you pushing it out to the most expensive part of the system? Like, get it to have the processing happen as much as possible, possibly locally on the device. And if that device happens to be a phone, then you live with what the phone can do. And phones, thankfully, are pretty powerful these days. But that also suggests possibly a blended or hybrid approach, which we touch on really quickly in the white paper as well. People, partially rendering some of this stuff with a cloud service, partially doing it on the client, and the in-betweens are taken care of by some system architectures that are still getting figured out. So that's also looking promising. And one thing I think that's a fallacy right now is for folks who are thinking Moore's Law is just going to magically solve this, but I think we're at least 2 orders of magnitude away from the cost making sense, even taking into account Moore's Law, which means another better part of a decade if it ever happens. So yeah, it's a complicated one, and sorry, we're not as bullish on cloud rendering for everything as some people are. But again, if you look at the history of this, Avi mentioned this before to me and offline, but it's true. What is it? Every 5 to 8 years, this cycles back to being popular and then goes away again, then leaves the conversation again as people realize how expensive or problematic it is.
Yeah, where it's going to be big, just as a tangent, is going to be on the AR side, because you want, when you finally get those all-day wearable glasses, they want them to be small, and so you're going to want computers around you. They call it edge usually, not cloud, but computers that are closer to you, so the latency is low, to be doing more of that work. But it's going to be very dynamic, and nobody's clear on how that's going to get paid for yet, right? Who owns them? How private are they? It's still a big ball of wax.
All right, next up, I'm going to swing the conversation back to our LAMINA1 subnets or metachains. We have a question that asks, how much will individual LAMINA1 subnets be able to scale? We're going to hand it over to Will again for this one.
They're going to go really fast. It's a tough question to answer. I can talk a little hypothetical and then kind of more practical, like what's it going to look like on day one. But kind of hypothetically, these subnets can be as fast as the creator, needs them to be in some ways. So we can define virtual machines that for very, very limited scope use cases that could process, tens or hundreds of thousands of transactions a second. Again, these aren't going to be general purpose compute environments, so you're not going to be able to write smart contracts that do whatever you want. There's going to be a very limited set of native transaction types that could be executed, and it's going to do those really fast, really quickly, and really cheaply. So that's one answer is, it depends on the needs of the creator, and you can define those transaction types to be, as limited or broad as you want, and your performance is going to reflect that decision. More concretely, I would say at mainnet, we're probably going to have 2 EVMs, 2 virtual machines that we provide to subnet creators. We'll have a standard EVM subnet, which will be capable of processing thousands of transactions a second. And for, creators who are used to building in Solidity, who have already deployed in other EVM chains like Ethereum or Polygon or Solana, or sorry, not Solana, they'll be able to migrate their chain over, or their project over to our chain very easily. But they're not going to get, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of transactions a second. Now, we do want to build like a kind of straw man initial virtual machine that we think would be highly valuable to some broad set of metaverse gaming creators. And that would, generally not be an EVM environment. It'll have low-level transaction types defined in Rust. And like the hope is that that would be capable of doing tens up to 100,000 transactions a second, depending on, the specs of the nodes themselves within the subnet. And again, what types of transactions that the developer themselves decides to define. So unfortunately, the answer is kind of like it depends. But I can say like initially, if you just want an EVM environment, you'll get over 1,000 transactions a second out of the box. That's the goal. And then if if you're looking for something more specialized, that's kind of one of the things we're really focused on providing. And the goal there would be to be, at least an order of magnitude or two higher than a standard EVM environment.
All right, and we don't have very much time left, so I'm going to end with a final question that feels like a good ender, which asks, how will you sustain the metaverse as a service stack in the long run?
So I guess I can start from the blockchain side of things, and maybe like Avi or Tony can pitch in as well, more in the open source generally, and how this would grow. But like I can't say I have a firm commitment when I answer this question, but we are obviously an open source platform. We're going to be enabling anyone who wants to fork it, adopt it, modify it, and contribute to it. So what I would like to see is a grassroots community of developers and creators and users start to form around the project. And that's part of what our early access program is meant to enable. That'll help us develop the project into the future. Now, I will say, like, generally speaking, in these blockchain platforms, there is always a need for a core team, or it's highly valuable for there to be a core team that has expertise and experience in the code base and in the protocols in the project to continue development. But when that's the case, you generally want to provide like some structure for how that development is funded and guided. And in the blockchain space, that's usually a combination of a relatively centralized foundation that usually has like a more traditional organizational structure that's able to take on like legal commitments, but it maybe has more transparency and a strict charter than, say, like a centralized profit-seeking organization. And then, you also usually have a DAO-like component or a structure, DAO meaning decentralized autonomous organization. And that's like, it's basically the community. It's an organization that's driven by a community. And it usually has some type of open democratic voting process. And both of these types of organizations usually work together to generally sustain the ecosystem through like funding, marketing, technical support through that. But the decision-making process is kind of different in each. So again, I can't speak exactly how this governance will turn out in our platform. I'm imagining it'll have components of both. But, it's been very important to us as a project and a team from the beginning to make it a collaboration with as many other players in this space as possible, which I think has been reflected in the many big and small partnerships we've already formed this early in the project. I don't know, Tony, Avi, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm going to just chime in with, I would say, one third component to this that is going to, I would hope, promise more longevity to an initiative like this would be the role of open standards organizations, and there are several of them. So you have outside of the project team and the larger community, you now start to form a sort of set of, if not governing bodies, at least guiding bodies who will shepherd this technology through the ups and downs of project ownership and various stakeholders. And the good news here is we're seeing nothing but enthusiasm and high interest. And this is really gratifying to me after over 25 years of grinding at this from pretty much everyone in the industry to get together and start laying down some principles around what these standards could look like. So these specs would exist outside of the code they're implemented in and beyond just, project owners like ourselves or the other folks who might step up. And I think that's going to be key because we're talking about global infrastructure. So, you need bodies on at the level of IEEE and ITF and W3C and Kronos and all these other, and the new ones that are forming, OMA3 and Metaverse Standards Forum. So I think that's a key component to it. as well, but I think you kind of need all three.
Yeah, the only thing I can add
Standards
to that, I
groups
think,
on their
is
own. Yeah, no, go ahead, Avi. I was just going to say, finally, sorry for the pause. Standards groups on their own are definitely no assurance that anyone's going to write quality code or build a good product. Yeah, go ahead, Avi.
it's usually like the first step, right? That the future is usually built of a weird conglomeration of existing standards, because of this next point, which is backwards compatibility, is really hard. That if you knew exactly the right thing to build and you put out a spec for it and everybody built for it, it would still change over time. And you don't want those changes to invalidate the work that everybody's done up to date. It's too hard to keep everything in sync with all this version stuff that happens. And so a lot of times you build it out of all the things you have and you put together the pieces as you can. And then you learn and you think about what would be a good way to tie these all together more consistently so that they're all using one big standard if possible. And then you got to get everybody to agree to it. But when you say sustain, to me, it's that process of committing to keep everything running constantly. Like nothing breaks over the weeks and months. Maybe now things that were written in Flash can't work anymore. Fortunately or unfortunately, you can complain about it or like that. But that doesn't happen every week. That happens over at really rare opportunities to try to upgrade the infrastructure. And so we're at that stage right now. We're trying to put together the first thing that will cover all these different topics, and then we can figure out how to upgrade it. But we have to be committed to that process the whole way.
Awesome. Well, we are officially 3 minutes over, and I know that we're all pretty busy, but thank you all so much for joining us. We've got a bunch of questions that we didn't get to this time around. So, maybe we'll be doing another Metaverse-as-a-Service AMA sometime soon so that we can get to the rest of them. But yeah, as a quick reminder before we hop off, everyone, just as I opened it, our white paper and accompanying quests are just running through the end of the week. So if you do not have your Metaverse-as-a-Service first look badge yet, make sure that you grab that by the end of the day today. There's also have a couple of community alerts. For those listening, we've got a testnet reset coming up, likely early next week. Our engineering team is working on that right now. Good news for us, we've got a reset before we transition over to BetaNet. So it's a lot of progress, but know that you're going to have to do a couple of steps to reset your wallet and reset your nodes if you are currently running a node or a validator. So stay tuned for directions on how to do that and when we hit the trigger. Also, as a final note, validator onboarding for testnet is also kicking off again. So if you filled out our node request form, you should have received an email this week about it. So keep an eye out on your inbox. We're going to be onboarding a couple of new cohorts immediately after the reset. Again, we're super excited to get more community members involved. And then finally, I'll just see you all on the Discord. We've got a few more sort of partnership related announcements coming soon that I am currently working with, and we're super excited to share with you. And we'll keep you posted on next steps for next week. But again, thanks so much for joining, and we will see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.